Contact. 7 Dominion warships crossing the lunar boundary. Estimated arrival in 3 minutes. A warning tone pulsed through the command deck, its oscillating chime sharp enough to carve through the tension thickening in the air. Commander Regis Volmark didn't flinch. He stood near the laser plasma display, the ghostly light flickering across his face as enemy markers surged forward like a steel tide. His fingers flexed at his sides, the only outward sign of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. 3 minutes, Vice Admiral Zyra Tolvan repeated beside him, her voice measured but coiled tight. Not even a demand for surrender. They don't issue ultimatums to creatures they consider beneath them. Volmark's lips barely moved. His focus remained on the heads-up display hovering before him, its luminous threads outlining the first wave of invaders like cracks spreading across glass. They think this will be clean, surgical. Earth, stripped, broken, absorbed into their dominion like a bone-swallowed whole. Tolvan exhaled sharply, then let them choke on it. The bridge thrummed with energy, an electric tension crackling through every officer and operator. The scent of alloy, warm metal, and reactor coolant clung to the air. Data streams glowed like molten veins feeding into the Excalibur's core, whispering unseen calculations into the ship's nervous system. Volmark turned, his silhouette cutting against the display's glow. Status of the quantum singularity drive? Dr. Lysis Drenhall, hunched over the engineering console, didn't look up. His fingers glided over tactile interfaces, his expression one of detached reverence, like a sculptor watching his masterpiece wake beneath his hands. Fully primed, singularity field at optimal stabilization. We phase in 60 seconds on your command. Then let's give them a lesson in miscalculation. Volmark stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the deck as he issued the order that would alter history. Engage. The first Dominion warships cut through lunar orbit like executioners arriving at a scaffold. Their hulls, iridescent crystalline leviathans, reflected the distant sun in fractured, shifting hues. But there was no fleet waiting, no planetary defenses scrambling to intercept, just the silent abyss and the unsuspecting shape of Earth below. High Legate Varun Solvex sat in the command throne of the Dominion flagship Vanquilor, his 6 black-irised eyes narrowing as his tactical officers fed him telemetry. No formations? No countermeasures? He murmured, the faintest trace of suspicion rippling beneath his otherwise indifferent tone. Either they are suicidally unprepared or impossibly arrogant. The thought barely had time to settle before his warpath sensors screamed. Space ruptured open, not with the burning wake of conventional FTL, nor the distortion of gravity drives. It was an absence, like a wound slashed into the very fabric of existence. And from that wound, the Excalibur emerged, a shadow where light refused to cling, a vessel that did not move through space, but rather forced space to move around it. Solvex's exospine stiffened instinctively. What in the void? The Dominion fleet barely had time to react before their sensor arrays collapsed into chaos. Readings scrambled, trajectories twisted into impossibilities. And then the Excalibur fired, not plasma, not missiles, something worse. A pulse of pure quantum disruption erupted from the battleship's forward banks, unraveling the Dominion's shielding before their systems even understood they'd been compromised. The Vanquilor's command deck erupted into warnings, red-streaked data scrolling across the heads-up displays. Solvex's second-in-command turned, his face tightening in confusion. Shields just failed. No impact detected, no breaches, just gone. Solvex's throat tightened. His gaze snapped to the main laser plasma display, where he watched in mute horror as one of his warships, the Tyraxis, began to fold inward on itself, like a mirror bending until it shattered. The Excalibur wasn't piercing their defenses, it was collapsing them. Solvex slammed his fist onto the control panel. All ships, break formation, open fire, now! It was a command given a fraction too late. The Excalibur vanished again, slipping into the lattice of folded space, a phantom on the battlefield. A breath, a silence. And then, it reemerged inside the Dominion formation, right behind the Vanquilor. Solvex had never known fear as a physical sensation, but the moment he turned and saw the impossible mass of the human battleship hanging above him like an axe, something deep in his bones turned to ice. The human vessel was so close his external cameras could make out the scorched plating of its hull, the etched insignia of its name, Excalibur, carved like a silent warning. Then the ship spoke. A transmission cut across the Dominion fleet's secured channels. Uninvited, untraceable, inescapable. Commander Volmark's voice filled every Dominion bridge. "This is where your war ends. You just don't know it yet." Tolvan's voice followed, quieter, a whisper of ice slicing through the airwaves. "Let's see if the Dominion can still fight without its shields." And then the Excalibur fired again. This time it didn't collapse defenses. It tore into the Dominion fleet like a predator sinking its fangs into prey. Ionized streams of destabilized matter carved through warships as if they were made of paper, whole segments dissolving before crews even had time to scream. The Vanquilor shuddered violently. Emergency sirens shrieked through its halls. And Solvex felt something he had not felt in centuries. Panic. He rose sharply from his throne. "All ships, regroup, counterstrike. Do not let them vanish again." But the Excalibur was already gone. Like a ghost, it phased out of reality once more. And in its wake, the Dominion fleet lay in ruins. On the Excalibur's bridge, Volmark exhaled, watching the battlefield shift on the laser plasma display. His crew stood in stunned silence, absorbing the sheer devastation they had just unleashed. Behind him, Drenhall whispered, not in awe, not in fear, but in realization. They weren't prepared. Volmark turned, his gaze a storm of ice. "They thought we were prey." Tolvan folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "So what do they think now?" Volmark glanced back at the wreckage, burning husks where invincible warships had once stood. He straightened. "They think they should be afraid." The Excalibur drifted through the void like a phantom, its dark hull absorbing what little light reached it. Behind it, the wreckage of Dominion warships floated in silent disarray. Shattered hulls twisted beyond recognition, their once mighty forms reduced to skeletal remains. Commander Regis Volmark stood at the heart of the command deck, watching the aftermath unfold across the laser plasma display. Enemy transponders blinked out one by one, fading like dying stars. Their fleet was broken, their arrogance crushed, and yet it wasn't over. "They're not running." Vice Admiral Zira Tolvan's voice cut through the air, taut with something just shy of satisfaction. "We turned their vanguard to ash, but the rest of the pack isn't scattering." Volmark's gaze darkened. The Dominion should have fractured, should have been clawing at their own desperation. Instead, they were holding formation, their remaining ships maneuvering with grim intent. "Patch me through," he said. A comlink engaged. The Dominion fleet's command channel cracked open like a vault forced ajar, and from its depths a voice emerged, Legate Varun Solvex. "You fight well for a species barely out of its cradle." His words held no tremor, no uncertainty, only the measured weight of a man who had spent lifetimes at war. "Your technology is unlike anything recorded in our archives, and your tactics, unexpected. But do you truly believe this changes anything?" Tolvan folded her arms, her gaze locking onto the heads-up display, as if she could see Solvex himself. "Considering how many of your ships are now debris, I'd say it changes a great deal." A low exhale, almost a laugh. "Loss is a matter of perspective." A new warning flared across the display, energy signatures spiking, Volmark's muscles tensed. Something was coming. Then the space before them collapsed inward. The Dominion fleet did not fire. They did not charge. Instead, the void warped and churned, bending into a singularity. A rift formed not by natural forces, but something else entirely. The Excalibur's instruments shrieked in protest. Not a jump gate, not a slipstream fold. This was something new. Then it arrived. A vessel unlike any Dominion warship seen before, emerging from the rift like a behemoth rising from the depths of an unseen ocean. It dwarfed the battlefield. its structure a nightmare of interwoven alloys and shifting energy patterns, its surface pulsing with a light that was neither fire nor electricity, but something different. Volmark didn't blink. Analysis. Dr. Lysis Drenhall was already scanning, his hands moving in fluid arcs over his console. The ship's readings were erratic, unstable, shifting between classifications the system couldn't recognize. That's not standard Dominion architecture. His voice held the rarest flicker of hesitation. Its structure isn't fixed. There are layers of something we've never seen before. And he stopped, exhaling sharply. Commander, there's no life support signature, no biological crew. Tolvan's gaze sharpened. An autonomous warship? Not just autonomous, self-evolving. A silence settled over the command deck. Volmark studied the ghostly specter of the ship, his mind weaving through the implications. The Dominion were arrogant, but not reckless. They wouldn't bring something like this into a fight unless they were certain it could destroy us. He turned back to the comm link. What is that? Solvex's response was almost amused. A lesson. The Dominion vessel surged forward. No weapons discharge, no visible projectile systems. And yet, the Excalibur's shields groaned. The energy field, once impenetrable, began to distort, rippling like liquid metal in a hurricane. Drenhall's hands flew over his console. They're not attacking in conventional terms. They're disrupting the fundamental cohesion of our defenses. It's unraveling the barrier itself. Volmark's pulse remained steady, his mind moving faster than his heartbeat. The Dominion had sent a ship designed to undo reality itself. He wasn't about to let them succeed. Tolvan, divert singularity reserves to the quantum fold drive, he ordered, his tone like a blade against steel. She glanced at him, eyes narrowing. That'll destabilize our phase cycle. It'll also let us do something they don't expect. The Dominion warship pressed forward, its eerie glow intensifying. The Excalibur's shield shivered, then failed completely. A flicker of alarm cut through the crew, but Volmark was already in motion. Engage QSD, now! The Excalibur did not retreat. It did not phase away to safety. Instead, it folded space around itself, then inverted the field outward. The Dominion ship reacted instantly, its pulsing light surging, adapting, trying to compensate. But it was too slow. The Excalibur's quantum singularity drive tore through the Dominion ship's energy lattice, forcing its shifting structure into something rigid, something vulnerable. For a fraction of a second, the Dominion warship was frozen in a reality it was never meant to exist within. That was all the time Volmark needed. Fire! The Excalibur's main disruptor array detonated, lancing through the Dominion vessel's core with a force that didn't just destroy. It erased. Matter collapsed inward, imploding in a silence that could not be heard, but was somehow felt. One moment, the Dominion's ultimate warship existed. The next, it didn't. Solvex's voice crackled over the comm link, devoid of its previous amusement. Impressive! Volmark exhaled, his expression unreadable. You sensed something you didn't understand, and now it's gone. Solvex was silent for a moment. Then, calm, collected, utterly unfazed, he replied, You misunderstand me, Commander. The laser plasma display flickered. Across the sector, new energy signatures emerged. 1, 2, 5, 12, more. The battlefield shifted, expanded, darkened with the arrival of ships identical to the one they had just destroyed. Consider that one a probe, Solvex continued. Now let's see what happens when you face the real force. The Dominion had not come to conquer. They had come to test humanity. And now they were ready to begin the war in earnest. Volmark's hands tightened into fists. Tolvan inhaled slowly. Drenhall whispered what they all knew. This was never their first wave. This was just them, taking our measure. Volmark stared at the expanding tide of Dominion vessels, his jaw locking as he reached for the comm. We hold our ground, he said, his voice an unshakable force against the dark tide coming for them. Then he issued the only order left to give. All hands, prepare for war. The Dominion fleet multiplied like a malignant growth, its warships bleeding into real space from unseen depths. Each arrival was another impossible vessel, another shapeless construct that pulsed and shifted like an unfinished thought, a design without an architect. On the Excalibur's bridge, the atmosphere thickened, every officer's movements deliberate, measured. The air held the tang of superheated circuitry, the bite of ionized metal clinging to every breath. The weight of what loomed ahead pressed into their bones. Regis Volmark watched in silence, his gaze locked on the laser plasma display, where Dominion ships formed a lattice of encroaching death. A swarm that did not rush to engage, but hung in anticipation like a predator waiting for its prey to make a fatal move. Vice Admiral Zira Tolvan shifted beside him, her brow furrowed. "They're watching." Volmark's jaw clenched. "Of course they are. Why wait?" Lysis Drenhall, hunched over his console, exhaled through his nose, scanning the ever-growing fleet. "They already know our capabilities, so why hold back? They don't just want to win." Volmark's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of steel grinding against stone. "They want to see if we panic first." Tolvan's fingers curled against the railing. "Then let's not give them the satisfaction." She turned sharply to weapons control, her voice snapping through the thick air. "Prepare the singularity lance. We punch through before they decide to strike." Before the order could be relayed, the Dominion moved, not in attack, not in retreat, but in synchronization. The moment was so seamless, so unnatural, that for a fraction of a second it looked as if the Dominion fleet had become a singular entity. Hundreds of warships shifting position in eerie unity, forming a shape that had no tactical logic, no recognizable formation. Drenhall's voice flattened to near silence. "What are they doing?" The Excalibur's scanners rippled with erratic data spikes, flooding the interface with information that had no readable patterns, no logic, no anchor in known warfare. "They're not preparing to fire," Volmark muttered, his mind racing through possibilities. "They're aligning to something." The heads-up display flickered, and for a fraction of a second, a distortion formed in the space between the Dominion ships, a ripple in the void, like an unfinished thought struggling to take shape. Then it was gone. A deep stillness fell across the bridge. Tolvan turned to Volmark, her voice lowering. "I don't like this." Neither did he. He tapped the comm. "Tactical, status report on that anomaly." The response came almost immediately, a voice edged with tension. "Sir, we can't confirm what it was. The distortion doesn't register as mass, energy, or even gravitational displacement. But whatever it is, it's not static, it's—" The officer hesitated. Volmark narrowed his eyes. "Speak." "It's learning." A chill crawled through the room like a phantom. Volmark turned sharply to Drenhall. "Run the anomaly through deep-dive analysis. Compare it to any known cosmic phenomena." Drenhall's fingers danced over his console, his normally detached demeanor tinged with something almost resembling unease. "Nothing matches." He exhaled slowly. "This isn't a natural event. It's an action." Volmark's gaze darkened. "Meaning it has intent." Tolvan turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "The Dominion is creating something." Volmark nodded. "And they need time to finish it. A warship moves to conquer, to crush, to dominate. But a war fleet that does not strike first? That is something else entirely." The thought coiled in his mind like a snake ready to strike. He stepped forward, voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "We're not waiting to see what they build. We stop this now." Tolvan didn't hesitate. "Orders?" Volmark turned to Drenhall. "Deploy Eidolon Spectres, full distortion cloak. I want our decoy fleets projecting misreads across every Dominion sensor they have." Drenhall's hands moved before Volmark even finished speaking, his expression sharpening into something dangerous. "Done." Volmark turned to Tolvan. "Load the quantum singularity lance. We take their central fleet cluster and cut them apart before they stabilize that distortion field." Tolvan's smirk was sharp, but her eyes carried no humor. "Finally, let's ruin their work." Across the bridge, operators moved with practiced precision. Energy readings surged, the Excalibur systems roaring to life, charging a weapon that had never been used in battle before. Drenhall glanced up. This will force their hand. If we fire, they won't just counter. They'll retaliate with everything they have. Volmark locked eyes with him. That's the idea. Drenhall hesitated. He had seen the logic before, but there was something else behind it this time. Commander, his voice was lower now, quieter, like something unspoken rested behind his words. Do you have a theory on what that thing is? Volmark didn't look away. I do. Drenhall swallowed. And? Volmark exhaled through his nose, his hands tightening behind his back. I don't think the Dominion is here to fight us. He glanced at the heads-up display where the distortion had flickered only moments ago. I think they're here to bring something into this war that was never supposed to exist. A stillness settled across the bridge, thick and suffocating. Tolvan tilted her head slightly. You're saying they're summoning something? Volmark's expression didn't change. Yes. Drenhall's pulse stilled in his throat. Then what happens if we stop them? Volmark turned back to the laser plasma display. His voice was even, controlled. That depends. On what? On whether we're already too late. The charge sequence locked in. The singularity lance activated, and the war took a turn no one had foreseen. The singularity lance discharged, and for a moment, reality itself rippled inward, as if the weapon had sliced through the very concept of space. A spear of absolute void ripped from the Excalibur's core, its trajectory locked onto the heart of the Dominion fleet's formation. The beam did not burn. It did not explode. It erased. The Dominion warships fractured upon impact, their structures unraveling at the subatomic level. No debris, no flames, just the quiet, unnatural dissolution of mass, like ink dissolving into water. The anomaly in the center of the fleet shuddered violently. It did not collapse. It adapted. The distortion, once a fragile flicker in space, swelled outward. Its shape no longer erratic, no longer unstable. It had form now. Purpose. Volmark stepped forward, watching the laser plasma display, his jaw tightening as he processed the impossible. The Dominion had not been creating something. They had been summoning something already waiting. Commander. Tolvan's voice was quiet, but edged with something brittle. Look at the readings. Drenhall was already scanning. That's not a rift anymore. It's anchoring. Something on the other side is stabilizing it. The distortion swelled again, and for the first time, the Dominion fleet moved in retreat, breaking formation and pulling away from the event horizon. It was not a surrender. It was deference. A chorus of warning tones erupted across the bridge as the anomaly solidified, forming a shape that did not obey physics, did not obey logic. Volmark's pulse slowed. No Dominion weapon, no technology had ever made him hesitate. But this was something older, something that had no name in any database. A structure emerged from the distortion, its shape both familiar and utterly foreign. It was not a ship. It was not a station. It was an artifact. It had no visible propulsion, no discernible engines or weaponry. Yet every sensor, every instrument aboard the Excalibur recoiled, as if in the presence of something that should not exist. The ship's AI flickered in protest, struggling to define the readings, cycling through failed classifications at a rate too fast for human comprehension. Drenhall whispered, "That's not Dominion." Volmark already knew. The artifact was not made by them. It had been found, and they had called it back. The artifact remained motionless, yet its presence was oppressive. It pressed into the senses, as if thought alone was enough to acknowledge it. Then the Excalibur's communications array ruptured with a transmission, one that had no origin, no frequency, no language. The heads-up display glitched, flickering through patterns, symbols, algorithms that no one had ever seen before. A presence uncoiled within the data streams, threading itself through the ship's systems without entry, without force, as if it had always been there, waiting. Tolvan's fingers curled against the control panel. "What is it doing?" Drenhal's breathing was controlled, but his eyes tracked the data like a man standing at the edge of an abyss. "It's not a weapon," he murmured. "It's a question." Volmark turned to him. "Explain." Drenhal's gaze did not lift from the lines of shifting data crawling across his interface. "This isn't an attack. It's an interface. Something is asking us to respond." Tolvan's jaw tensed. "Do we respond?" Volmark didn't answer. His mind sifted through the puzzle, the impossible logic behind Dominion strategy. This wasn't how they fought. They didn't bow. They didn't summon. So why this? Unless this war had never been about them at all. Volmark exhaled. "Open a relay. Strip down the interference." Tolvan's fingers hesitated over the controls. "We don't know what we're interfacing with." "We know it's not them." His voice was steady. "That's enough." Drenhal nodded once, a silent confirmation. Tolvan gave no further argument. Her fingers moved over the controls. Connection open. The Excalibur's display dimmed, flickered, reassembled. The ship was no longer showing Dominion formations or battlefield projections. Instead, the heads-up display shifted to something else entirely. A vision, not a transmission, not an image, a memory not their own. The bridge crew stiffened, their bodies gripped by an unnatural stillness as their minds processed the impossible. They saw a civilization long before any recorded empire, a species that had walked the stars before the Dominion had even learned how to forge metal. They saw a war that did not end, a conflict that had no victors, only survivors who buried their history in the dark. And they saw what the Dominion had uncovered. Not a relic, a warning. Volmark pulled himself from the vision with sheer force of will, his heart hammering against his ribs. His breath was sharp, his throat dry. He turned to Tolvan, to Drenhal. Their expressions mirrored his own. Understanding, horror, disbelief. Tolvan was the first to find her voice. "They weren't summoning it." Drenhal exhaled slowly. "They woke it up." Volmark turned back to the display. The artifact remained unmoving, but the Dominion fleet was no longer in a battle stance. They had shifted position, forming a perimeter, not around the Excalibur, but around the artifact itself. Volmark's hands tightened behind his back. "They're not preparing to attack us." His voice was quiet, lethal. "They're making sure we don't leave." Tolvan's gaze darkened. "They think we're part of this." "We are now," Drenhal murmured. "They won't let us leave without understanding why we saw that." Volmark's gaze did not move from the artifact. The Dominion had come to test them. That much had been true, but not as an enemy, not as a conqueror, as a gauge, a measure, to see if humanity was ready to understand what they had unearthed. Volmark's breath was slow, measured. He turned away from the display. "Tolvan." She straightened. "Commander." His voice was even, calm. "Prepare a boarding party." Drenhal turned sharply. "Boarding? That's a—" He caught himself, exhaled. "You think it wants us to?" Volmark's gaze never wavered. "Something does." Tolvan didn't hesitate. "I'll assemble the team." Drenhal exhaled through his nose. "Then I'm coming." Volmark turned to him, expression unreadable. Drenhal met his gaze. "That thing didn't just broadcast to the ship. It connected to me. I felt it." He swallowed. "If we go in blind, we're walking into something we don't understand. We need context." Volmark studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then we move." The Dominion watched from a distance, their fleet unbroken, their movements measured, waiting, not for battle, for the next move. And humanity had no choice but to make it. The boarding shuttle detached from the Excalibur, slipping through the Dominion perimeter with eerie ease. No resistance, no interference. The warships that had torn apart civilizations, that had turned planets into cauterized husks, simply watched. Waiting. Commander Regis Volmark stood at the front of the shuttle, gaze fixed ahead. The artifact loomed beyond the viewport, a monolithic presence that did not belong to any known epoch. It was neither smooth nor jagged. It existed in contradiction, a construct that seemed unfinished yet impossibly ancient. a shape built for no hands to touch, no eyes to witness. Drenhall was silent beside him, knuckles whitening over the console. His breathing was controlled, but Volmark could see the tension threading through his frame. "You can still stay behind," Volmark said without looking. Drenhall didn't move. "I don't think it would let me." That was enough. The shuttle approached the artifact's outer structure, passing through an energy field that flickered like the shimmer of oil on water. Volmark expected resistance, a repulsion force, a defensive trigger, but nothing came. Instead, the ship drifted through the veil as if it had been permitted entry long before it arrived. The moment the shuttle crossed the threshold, every instrument shorted to static. Tolvan's voice crackled through the comms. "We just lost telemetry. Readings are—" Then the channel cut. Dead silence. The artificial gravity lurched as the shuttle's stabilizers flickered. The ship shuddered, not from turbulence, but something more fundamental. Like reality itself was questioning whether it should be here. "Brace," Volmark ordered. The shuttle descended into the darkness. They stepped out into a void without shadow. There were no walls, no corridors, but they were somewhere. The ground beneath them was not solid in the conventional sense. It shifted with their movements, but it held. The air was neither cold nor warm, yet their bodies reacted as if adjusting to a new atmosphere. A pulse, deep and distant, thrummed at the edge of hearing. Not a sound, a presence. Tolvan's voice was steady, but there was something deliberate about how she stood, how her fingers curled near the weapon at her hip. "If this is a ship, it's unlike anything we've ever classified." Drenhall wasn't listening. His eyes were locked ahead, pupils dilated. He wasn't looking at the walls, because there were none. He was looking at the space where walls should be. "There's something—" He swallowed. "There's something watching." Volmark felt it too. Not a mind, not a consciousness in the way humans understood, but an intent. Then the darkness shifted. No movement, no sound. And yet it changed. The boarding team tensed as the air around them folded into shape, structures forming where none had been before, as if existence was correcting itself to accommodate their presence. Tolvan's grip tightened around her weapon. "This place is building itself around us." "No." Drenhall's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's remembering." Volmark turned to him. "Explain." Drenhall's breaths were measured, his mind piecing together fragments of understanding as they unraveled in real time. "This isn't a ship," he exhaled. "It's an archive." And it had just decided to show them what was inside. The structure solidified, and suddenly they were somewhere else. No transition, no warning. One moment, they were standing in a void that did not exist. The next, they stood on the surface of a world long turned to dust. The sky above them was fractured glass, holding back a light that did not burn. Towers stretched toward the heavens, their shapes unnatural, geometry that did not belong in three-dimensional space. The city was empty, not abandoned. Empty. As if it had never been lived in, yet bore the memory of life. Tolvan's breath was slow, deliberate. "What is this place?" Drenhall stepped forward, his fingers grazing a pillar that shimmered under his touch, as if made of liquid and stone at once. A warning. And then the voices came. Not sound, not speech, echoes of something greater. They did not hear words, they felt meaning. An empire without name, a war without victors. A mistake that had never been undone. And then the memory shifted. The city was no longer empty. Figures walked the streets, tall, their forms both solid and shifting, beings who had shaped the first great era of the stars. And at the heart of the city, the artifact sat upon a throne of worlds, not a relic, a prison. Volmark exhaled through his teeth, stepping forward. "They didn't build this, did they?" Drenhall shook his head. "They found it, just like the Dominion did." Tolvan's fingers twitched near her weapon. "Then what did they lock inside?" Silence. Then the world fractured. The sky above ripped apart, the light behind it bleeding through. Volmark's mind reeled as the memory collapsed, pulling them through fragmented glimpses of something waking, a force that had no name, no form, only the certainty that it should not exist. Then, they were back, standing in the void once more. The structures vanished, the city erased, as if the artifact had merely pulled back the curtain for a moment. Drenhall swayed, bracing himself against nothing. His breathing was shallow. Tolvan steadied him. What the hell was that? Volmark turned back to the abyss that had not moved, yet had never been still. They didn't build a prison, he murmured. They built a warning. The weight of the realization settled over them like a falling sky. The Dominion had not come to conquer. They had come to stop something. And now humanity had torn open the wound without realizing it. Tolvan exhaled sharply. Commander, I don't think we should be here. Drenhall straightened, his voice quieter than before. I don't think we can leave. The air shifted again, and for the first time, something inside the artifact moved. Not a structure, not a memory. Something alive. Volmark's muscles tensed, not in fear, not in hesitation, in understanding. He turned to Tolvan. Get us out. She didn't move, not because she refused, because the artifact wouldn't let them. The Dominion ships outside had never been their enemies. They had been humanity's last warning. And now they were too late to heed it. The air tightened, a force pressing against their lungs, not suffocating, but alien, like a presence reshaping the very laws of physics around them. The void that had been empty moments ago no longer felt vacant. Something else had entered, something that had always been here, waiting to be acknowledged. Commander Regis Volmark felt the shift in his bones before his mind could catch up. His instincts screamed to move, to pull his team back, but his body didn't obey. Not paralysis, not fear. Something deeper, a whispering force, not a voice, but an understanding, threaded through the darkness. Drenhall inhaled sharply beside him. His pupils were dilated, his expression caught between revelation and horror. It's not speaking, he murmured. It's showing. Volmark's pulse slowed, controlled. Showing what? Drenhall swallowed. Us. The void peeled open. It was not light that emerged, but something colder, something that bent perception around it like a warped lens. For the first time since stepping aboard, Volmark saw it. Not a creature, not a machine, a concept, given form. The figure was featureless yet defined, a silhouette that existed outside the constraints of symmetry or logic. The details were in constant flux, shifting through shapes that flickered between the past and something that had never yet come to pass. A being that was not bound to a single moment in time. Tolvan's breath left her in a controlled exhale. Her hand remained near her weapon, but she did not reach for it, because there was no point. If this thing had wanted them dead, they would never have stepped inside to begin with. Volmark's voice was steady. Are you the ones who built this? The being did not answer. Instead, the world fractured around them once more. The illusion of the void shattered, replaced by something more terrible than war. They stood on a battlefield that had never been recorded. Ruins stretched into infinity, not remnants of a war, but of something far worse. A history that had been erased, not by time, but by intent. The sky cracked above them, the weight of forgotten battles pressing into their bones. This was not the past. This was a memory from something that had survived it. Tolvan took a slow step forward, her boots meeting the ash-covered ground, yet no weight pressed into it, as if the very ground itself was reluctant to be remembered. Drenhall exhaled, watching the fragments of ruined structures contort, their architecture refusing to hold form. I think, he whispered, this place is still disassembling. Volmark turned his gaze upward, where the sky itself seemed to fracture inward, as though space was breaking like brittle glass. The entity's presence lingered beside them, unchanging, unmoving. Drenhall's voice was quieter now. This isn't a war. This is something else. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the memory shifted. The ruins faded, and suddenly they were not alone. Figures stood in the remnants of the battlefield, shadows, outlines of a species long buried beneath time. Their features were not dominion, not human, something older. Tolvan turned her head slightly, studying the faint echoes of what might have once been warriors, scientists, leaders. She understood before anyone else. "They're not part of the memory," she murmured. "They're still here. Not alive, not dead, just present." Then the realization set in, slow and terrible. This was not an artifact. This was a tomb, and it had never been abandoned. The moment they understood, the shadows moved. They turned, not in hostility, not in fear, but in recognition. Drenhal's fingers curled at his sides, his body visibly resisting an instinct to step back. "They see us." Volmark's voice did not waver. "They always have." The figures shifted, their features lost to the unnatural way their forms folded between existence and absence. Then, the entity that had led them here finally acted. A wave of unseen force pressed through their skulls, bypassing language, bypassing sound, delivering meaning directly into their minds. Not words, an offer. Tolvan's breath slowed. "They want something." Drenhal's gaze darkened. Not something. A choice. Volmark's mind worked through the fractures of understanding, the scattered pieces finally coalescing. The Dominion hadn't just woken something up. They had triggered a decision that had once been made long ago and had never been completed. He turned his gaze back to the figures, to the ruins, to the remnants of a war that had never been allowed to end. And he knew. This place was not just a prison. It was a question that had never been answered. The war that had buried this place had never stopped. It had simply gone dormant. And now it was asking humanity what part they intended to play. Volmark exhaled slowly, shoulders squared, as he turned back toward the entity that had brought them here. "You've been waiting," he murmured. The being did not move, but the world shifted again, not to another memory, not to another battlefield. This time, they saw only one thing, the Dominion, their ships, their empire, all of it, pulled into the abyss, devoured by something far greater. A glimpse of a future that had not yet arrived, but would, unless something changed. Drenhal's throat tightened. "They don't want a war." Tolvan inhaled sharply. "They want us to decide if one is necessary." Volmark held the entity's gaze. He saw what it was offering, and what would happen if he refused. He turned to his team. "We need to leave." Drenhal blinked, startled. "What? We haven't—" "We have," Volmark interrupted. His voice was steady, his decision already made. "We saw what we needed to see." Tolvan's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly did we see?" Volmark turned back toward the figures in the ruins, toward the weight of a history no species should have ever uncovered. A war waiting to happen. Drenhal's breath slowed. "And?" Volmark's gaze remained locked on the shadows. His expression was unreadable. He stepped back, his voice lower now. "Now we have to decide whether we start it or finish it." The Dominion ships had not moved. They had not fired. They had simply waited. And as the Excalibur's boarding shuttle emerged, something shifted across the fleet. A silent acknowledgement. They knew. Tolvan exhaled as she took her seat. "They're not attacking." "No," Volmark murmured, strapping in. "Because they were never here to kill us." Drenhal's fingers curled against his knee. "Then what were they here for?" Volmark's gaze remained ahead, where the artifact still loomed, untouched, unchanged. "They were waiting to see if we were strong enough to understand what we just saw." The Excalibur's comlink flickered. A message from the Dominion. No threats, no warnings, only a single chilling statement. "The choice is now yours." Volmark exhaled. Then the Excalibur turned toward the war waiting beyond the stars. The Excalibur slipped into formation, its massive structure cutting through the black like a blade unsheathed in the dark. The Dominion fleet had not moved since their return. No weapons drawn, no advance, only the weight of expectation settling in the space between them. In the command deck, Regis Volmark stood before the heads-up display, his expression unreadable. The artifact still loomed on the screen, distant now, but its presence still heavy in his mind. A reminder of what they had just seen. A war frozen in time, waiting to be resolved. A choice forced upon them, one that could no longer be ignored. Tolvan broke the silence first. "We're not leaving without a plan." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Not fear, but calculation. The mind of a tactician grasping at pieces yet to be assembled. She had seen what Volmark had seen, even if she did not fully understand it. Drenhall exhaled sharply, his gaze locked onto his console. "They expect an answer." His fingers hovered over the interface, hesitating. "And we have nothing to give them." Volmark's eyes flicked toward him. "We have something." He turned back to the display, his gaze narrowing. "They're waiting to see if we're capable of doing what they couldn't." Tolvan frowned. "Which is?" "Ending this." She scoffed, arms folding. "And what does that look like? We're standing between an empire that doesn't trust us and an unknown force that hasn't even shown its hand yet. What's our move?" Volmark's fingers tapped against his forearm. The rhythm was slow, methodical. Not hesitation, but construction. The pieces were aligning, but they needed to be placed in the right order. "We're not the first to face this," he said, his tone measured. "The ones who built that place, they had power, technology, maybe even greater than ours. But they still failed." Drenhall's voice was quiet. "Because they chose wrong." Volmark nodded. "We need to understand why." The room fell silent. The crew listened, waiting. Their commander wasn't giving orders yet. He was building something in his mind, and they knew better than to interrupt it. Tolvan leaned against the console, studying him. "You already have a theory." He glanced at her. "I do." She gestured. "Then let's hear it." Volmark exhaled, the tension in his shoulders shifting as he turned toward the display. "The Dominion isn't just reacting to us. They've known about this for a long time. And for all their arrogance, they're afraid." Drenhall's brows furrowed. "Afraid of what?" Volmark tapped the screen, highlighting the formation of the Dominion fleet. Their ships weren't aligned for an attack. They were positioned defensively, as if bracing for an external threat. "They didn't come here to destroy us," he said. "They came to make sure we weren't a liability. If we weren't strong enough, they would have eliminated us." Tolvan tilted her head slightly. "And since we're still breathing, they've decided we might be useful." The weight of those words settled over the room. Drenhall exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "That doesn't explain what they're waiting for. If they just wanted to test us, they'd have made their move already." Volmark's jaw tightened. "They don't want to fight alone." The silence returned, heavier this time. Tolvan was the first to break it. "You think they want an alliance?" Volmark's expression darkened. "Not an alliance." His gaze lingered on the artifact, the ruins of something greater than either human or Dominion history could comprehend. "They want a scapegoat!" The realization hit like a blade slipping between ribs. Drenhall's breath stilled. "They want us to make first contact." Volmark nodded. The logic was there, cold, brutal, and undeniable. The Dominion, despite its dominance, had held back from whatever lay beyond the artifact. They had drawn lines in the sand, kept their forces at a distance, never fully breaching the unknown. Because they didn't want to be the ones to do it. They wanted someone else to force the confrontation. Tolvan's fingers curled against the console. "That's why they're waiting." Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the realization with the efficiency of a strategist, seeing the board for what it truly was. "They want us to be the trigger." Drenhall's hands tightened over the controls. "And if we refuse?" Volmark's expression did not change. "Then they make sure we're not an obstacle." No one spoke. The weight of the choice pressed down on all of them. They had walked into this thinking they were uncovering a hidden war, a buried history. But they weren't just witnesses. They were now the deciding factor. Tolvan inhaled slowly, gaze flicking over the fleet. Then we need to make sure we control how this happens. Volmark met her eyes. The understanding between them was instant. He turned to the command deck. We move carefully. No aggression. No signs of hesitation either. We let them see that we're making a choice on our own terms. Drenhall adjusted his stance, his hands steadying. And when we make contact? Volmark exhaled, his mind already constructing the next steps. We prepare for the unknown. His gaze locked back onto the artifact, the place where history had been buried under the weight of forgotten mistakes. And he knew this was the beginning of something far worse than war. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, every officer slipping into their role as the Excalibur adjusted course. The Dominion fleet watched, motionless, as humanity stepped forward, not as pawns, but as the ones who would decide what happened next. And deep within the artifact, something shifted. Waiting, watching. The war had not begun, but it was coming. The Excalibur drifted toward the artifact, the weight of the moment pressing against the bridge like the silence before a storm. The Dominion fleet held its formation, unmoving, unchallenging, sentinels waiting for an answer. Inside the command deck, Ragus Volmark stood before the heads-up display, watching the growing mass of the structure fill the screen. The artifact no longer flickered between definitions. It had chosen to be seen. Now, it was waiting for them to act. Tolvan leaned forward against the console, eyes locked on the shifting exterior of the construct. They've made sure we understand. Volmark nodded. They want us to be the ones who open the door. Drenhall exhaled, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. His usual detached demeanor had been stripped away, leaving only raw comprehension. They've spent centuries watching it, studying it, and they never set foot inside. Because they already knew, Volmark said. Once you step in, you don't get to turn back. Silence held over the bridge. Then the artifact responded. Not through sound, not through communication in any recognizable form. Through the ship itself. The heads-up display flickered, words they could not read, coordinates they had never charted. A doorway into something that should never have been reopened. The Excalibur's power levels surged. Drenhall's fingers danced over the console, his breath short. It's interfacing with us, not overriding, not forcing, just allowing. Tolvan stared at the new readings, her voice quiet. Permission. A realization settled in the room, unspoken but understood. This was not an invasion, not a war waiting to be reignited. This was an invitation. Volmark turned to his crew. Options? Drenhall straightened. We sever the connection now. We might be able to back out before... Before. That word hung between them, unfinished, because they all knew. There was no before, not anymore. Tolvan inhaled slowly. We move forward, we step into something bigger than the Dominion, bigger than us. Volmark held the weight of her words. Then he gave the only order that mattered. We proceed. The ship acknowledged before the crew did. The Excalibur's quantum singularity drive activated, the lattice folding around them as the artifact's gravitational lock seized their trajectory. For the first time in human history, Earth's strongest warship was no longer in known space, and for the first time since its creation, the artifact opened its doors. They were not inside it, not in the way a ship enters a station or a soldier steps into a battlefield. They were within a space that had no center, no end. Volmark adjusted his stance, his boots touching solid ground that did not exist. His breath moved through air that should not have been there. The world around them shifted, rewriting itself in fractal glimpses of memories not their own. Tolvan took slow steps forward, hand resting lightly on her weapon, not in fear, but in preparation. This is... It's what came before, Drenhall interrupted. We're not in a place. We're in a record. Volmark turned. A record of what? Drenhall's fingers curled against his palms. Failure. The space around them reacted to that word. The shifting echoes of forgotten structures stilled. The air thickened. a presence uncoiled. It was not a voice. It was a conclusion waiting to be understood. And then they saw it. Not through sight, through understanding. The first war. Not between empires, not between species. Between existence and something that had no place in it. A force that had not been born but had slipped into reality like a blade pressed between the ribs of the universe itself. It had no purpose, no intent, only consumption, an absence that became hunger, and a war that had ended with only a delay. The beings that had built this place, who had forged entire civilizations into weapons against it, had not been victorious. They had only bought time, and now that time had run out. Volmark exhaled, his throat tightening against the weight of understanding. He turned to Drenhall. "Can we stop it?" Drenhall didn't answer immediately. He swallowed, shaking his head. The war didn't end because they won. It ended because they sealed it away. Tolvan's voice was quiet. Then why did they fail? Drenhall hesitated, then turned toward the emptiness ahead. Because something else opened the door. Volmark's gaze darkened. The Dominion. Drenhall's hands curled into fists. They thought they could control it. They had been wrong, and now humanity was standing in the wreckage of that mistake. Volmark's fingers flexed at his sides. His mind was moving faster than his breath, piecing together what needed to be done. The Dominion would not fight this war. They had already chosen retreat. But humans did not retreat. Volmark turned back toward the ship, toward the crew that stood waiting for a command that had never been spoken before in history. Tolvan studied him. "You already know what we're going to do, don't you?" He met her gaze. "We do what they couldn't." Drenhall exhaled. "You mean we do what got them all killed?" "No," Volmark said. "We do it right." A pause. Then Tolvan's mouth curled into a smirk that held no humor, only acceptance of what had always been inevitable. "Well," she muttered, rolling her shoulders, "that's going to piss them off." Volmark exhaled, turning back toward the artifact's shifting walls, toward the remnants of a war that had never truly ended. Then he stepped forward, into the unknown, and the Excalibur followed. Because humanity had never been given a place in the stars. They had taken it, and now they were about to take the war that came with it. The Dominion had feared the battle. The artifact had waited for a decision, but humanity had already made its choice, and the galaxy would learn what that choice meant.